This meeting is being recorded.
Our topic is the market process, which is covered in Chapter 1 of the textbook. So what I want to do is just give an overview of the really important topics that I believe are necessary to understand as we speak about the process of marketing. So this will be a bit of a historical review of what has led to marketing as we understand it nowadays, but it builds our knowledge of what has led to the current market orientation that we see as being so desirable. So what we want to do first of all is just get a handle on a good definition of marketing. And a good definition is always going to involve the idea of exchange. And exchange is giving something to get something back. At the crux of marketing, that's what's always involved. As you look at different definitions of marketing, you'll always find something touching on the issue of exchange where something is created and provided to purchasers or consumers, and they give up something in return to gain that. That's the practice of marketing. And something of value must be exchanged for something of value. So that concept of exchange is critical to understanding what marketing is all about and how proper marketing is conducted. So to have an exchange situation, there must be at least two parties, but there can be more. Sometimes there can be three-way exchanges. Sometimes there can be multiple parties involved in the exchange with the things given up to one or more parties to receive from one or more parties. So the complexity of exchange can be quite great, or it can be just as simple as going by the old example was the neighborhood lemonade stand that some kids had put out, paying them a quarter for a cup of lemonade. That's simple exchange. Value is really important to the idea of exchange. Value being what someone thinks something is worth, in that case, the marketer, that ties into their offering that they are making available. Value also what the ultimate user, the consumer or the purchaser thinks what they're buying is worth. If the values match, then the purchaser goes away feeling satisfied. Their expectations were met. We talk about that more in Chapter 2. If the purchaser feels that their expectations were exceeded, they tend to think they got a great value on something. If their expectations are not met, though, they perceive that they did not get good value for what they gave up, and their chances of establishing repeat business with the provider are minimized. They're harmed quite a bit if that happens. Decisions to enter into exchange relationships are not always rational. And the reason that's mentioned is that if you've taken economics courses, you've learned that much of economics, up until the last 15 years or so, has really been based on the idea of rational man. Now, I'm not trying to be sexist with that term, but more to mankind, to humankind, that all decisions are driven by a sense of rationality. And we know that that's not true. Particularly from a lot of studies of psychological processes. We know that there are rational processes that people engage in, but there are also irrational processes. And the irrational doesn't necessarily mean wrong, but sometimes emotions play a much stronger role than rationality does. So we understand exchange relationships through the lens of rationality. But again, we have to really be cognizant of the fact that decisions of any type, but particularly exchange decisions, are not always influenced by rationality. The school of thought that reflects that in economics is called behavioral economics. There's been a lot of work on that in about the past 15 years or so, and it attempts to bring into the studies some recognition of the fact that emotions do play a role in the decisions that people make. So the decisions are not always rational. Sometimes that works to a marketer's advantage, sometimes it does not. So what happens during the process of exchange? Very simply, raw materials are transformed to saleable products. Now, they could be in process products, they could be component parts for an ultimate finished product. If you think about the automobile industry, there are many suppliers to the automobile industry that furnish their products to the automobile manufacturers that result in a finished product. For example, tire companies buy raw rubber products from rubber plantations, and they manufacture the tires. They send them to the Nissan factory or the General Motors factory or the Toyota factory or the Ford factory to be put on vehicles that will be sold as brand new. But there are also suppliers that manufacture the windshields. They buy the raw glass making material, the silica and the sand. They make windshields. They sell that to the automobile manufacturers. There are companies that make the seats that go into the finished products. But they all start with raw materials, and they end up being into some type of saleable product. They're not just pure commodities. So the production process creates these finished goods, whether they are component parts or finished products that will be sold to ultimate users. But in addition to the finished goods, waste and byproducts are also generated. Now, my professional background involved working for Hershey Chocolate. It's kind of interesting to think of that because the production process to create candy, a byproduct of that used to be cocoa powder. And then it was found that that could be sold. So Hershey's cocoa in the can that you use in baking used to be a byproduct of the chocolate process. Waste is a concern for many businesses, and many businesses have come up with ways to either recycle waste materials or to utilize waste materials in a way that is not harmful to the community or to the environment. And again, I'll go back to my time with Hershey. During the production runs of confection products at Hershey, there's always going to be situations where some products go off the assembly line, they touch the floor, and they cannot be sold to humans. Now, I'm going to promise you that based on my time there, those floors are kept very, very clean, even in some of the factories that are quite old. But what they did with those waste products was they would sell them to farmers in the area who would feed them to their pigs or cattle. So therefore, it wasn't just wasteful in the sense that it had to be thrown away. It was waste in that it could not be sold to humans, but they found a use for the product and a profitable use for the product. They didn't just give it away, they sold it. But a lot of production processes, there's a lot of waste that is produced. And so the challenge of disposing of that waste in a responsible manner, sometimes even in a profitable manner or a profit neutral manner, could be extremely desirable. So organizations seek to dispose profitably of all of the above, not just the products that they manufacture or the finished goods. And we will consider services to be finished goods here, but also the waste and the byproducts associated with it. That shows the degree of responsibility that's become more and more important over the past few years. Ideally, the recipients of those products that enter into the exchange relationships to gain them realize value. So the recipients of the waste and the byproducts may also receive value or negative impacts to the community, to society, to the environment, to the producing firm, to the consumer may be minimized also. So that's part of a challenge in the process of exchange. What's the purpose of exchange? Why is it so important? And that is where marketing really comes into play, where goods and services are allocated based on the idea of supply and demand. Marketing comes up with products that can produce value for members of a market or market segment. They communicate the value proposition. And so this exchange process helps to resolve discrepancies between demand for things and supply of things. And so this mechanism of marketing, this mechanism of exchange that's used in marketing is felt to be much more efficient than in state-run economies where the state dictates who gets what or how much something should sell for. We can see some great examples of that going on right now in a socialist economy in Venezuela, which is an absolute disaster at the time I record this lecture. We can look at North Korea, which has been just harmed immensely by the communist regime, where instead of marketing taking place, the state is charged with allocating things. It's not to say that marketing is perfect, but it's probably the best system out there for trying to uh, arrive at efficient distribution of goods and services to meet demand and to balance supply and demand. We know this. Everyone cannot have everything that they desire. That's where value comes in, the price that a producer attaches to something to give a signal of what they think it's worth, to provide an idea to ultimate purchasers of what they should be willing to pay. Sometimes those prices change a little bit, but we all have somewhat of an understanding of what value is there. So, purpose of exchange is to resolve those discrepancies, but also provides value to both parties involved, or to all parties, I should say, by satisfying their needs in the want. So the marketer has an idea of the value, reflects that in the price. If the exchange is entered into, the purchaser or the user will make an ultimate determination of value. They could be satisfied, highly satisfied, or dissatisfied, but the marketer should receive something of sufficient value in return to help them keep the doors open and the lights on, to stay in business, maybe even to make a profit and grow. Ideally, the purchaser or user should be pleased with the value they receive. It helps them accomplish the purpose they had in mind. It solves a problem that they needed to solve. It satisfies a want or a need that existed. That way, value is provided. Now, I do want you to know that value is not always uh, in financial terms. It could be utilitarian value. If you think of nonprofit organizations involved in marketing, think of a blood bank, for example, and they issue appeals to get people to give blood, and people respond. They come in, they donate their blood. What do they get in return? Well, they get a cup of orange juice and a granola bar, but that's not really what they give the blood for. What they get in return is an intrinsic source of satisfaction that they've done something noble, they've done something beneficial to society, they've helped someone out that in most instances, they'll never know. But giving blood is incredibly valuable if you've ever been on the receiving end of having had blood during a surgical procedure, if you've needed a blood transfusion, excuse me. So money was not exchanged in those instances, but an exchange situation was entered into. Blood was given up, but what was received was not financial, it was intrinsic in value. So we know now that value is determined by comparing the benefits or the positive outcomes with the costs incurred. There always has to be something given up to get something in return for exchange to occur. And that determination of value is something that we all get used to very quickly in our life. A very popular expression we have is just wasn't worth it. In other words, the value wasn't there. Or, man, did I get a great deal, which means we got incredible value for something. My family jokes with me and my son a little bit. My son just had to get rid of a vehicle that had been in our family for about 17 years. And he kind of laughed and he said, I was hoping to get it to 250,000 miles. It was a car that was a 2002 model that four of us in the family had driven at one time or another. Kind of a long story there. But he had been driving it the past few years, didn't have any payments on it. We had owned the car, gave it to him, and he commuted to work in it. That's all he used it for, and it was a great deal to him. But so he got great benefits out of it, and then he had to buy a new car, and he was trying to keep the cost down to balance that out with. I had purchased a car back in '99 and drove it for 15 years. My family used to joke I would never get rid of it, but I did after about 160,000 miles. So, some people say, well, if you get a new car and you finance it for more than 4 years, you're doing it all wrong. But if you drive the car for 15 years, you're getting a lot of value out of it. And then finally, successful exchange or exchanges bring satisfaction to all the parties involved. Now, typically, we view this with two parties being involved, but that satisfaction that is brought to both parties for the producer, for the supplier, the manufacturer, the marketer, the satisfaction comes not just from the financial benefits gained, but also nowadays from pleasing the customer. Okay, from contributing to a desirable relationship with the customer. The customer now derives satisfaction, as I mentioned a while ago, from solving a problem, from fulfilling a need or a want that they have, but also perhaps from gaining an appreciation of what the marketer does for them, and also feeling a strengthening of the relationship, which is very important in marketing nowadays. So exchange, it sounds so simple. We're used to it. So what are some of the factors that could complicate exchange in the marketing sense? First of all, competition. We understand the different market structures that are out there, ranging from monopoly, where there's a single provider, to monopolistic competition, to an oligopoly, to just a completely pure market where everything is commoditized. So when we get into things like monopolistic competition, where products can be very similar and firms struggle to differentiate them, there's a lot of work that goes into that. Even in an oligopolistic structure where there are few members of a particular industry. And the traditional example has been the automobile industry for oligopolistic structure. The competition is still very intense. And so the challenge for marketers is how to differentiate their products, even though many of the products accomplish the same purposes for users. Think of televisions right now, HD TVs, and the number of manufacturers that make HD TVs, and they can range from incredibly inexpensive large screen TVs, 45, 50, 55 inches that cost less than $300, to TVs 40, 45 to 55 inches that may cost several $1,000s. What's the difference there? How do the producers of the TVs that cost much more successfully differentiate their products from those that make TVs that cost much less? Sometimes when you look at the pictures side by side, it's incredibly difficult to determine what the actual difference is. Think of clothing. How do you differentiate clothing? And that's where things like branding come into play, where the same clothes could be made by one manufacturer that just puts different tags on them, and the price on one could be twice as much as the other. So that really complicates the exchange relationship, where one marketer might say, I can provide you with a coat to keep you warm. One marketer might put out the message, I can provide you with a TV to help you be entertained. How do you differentiate the more expensive offerings in the same category? That's a challenge that marketers undertake and have to meet successfully. And then also establishing the value of the differences that exist, or the relative advantage. Now, the relative advantage is a term that's going to be very important, because an advantage may be there, it may be present, but if the target market cannot perceive the advantage, if they cannot understand the value that advantage would bring, it's useless to have it. So one of the examples frequently discussed is back in the days where video and movie recordings were something that could be made and rented instead of digital applications now. There were VCRs that used two different kinds of technology, Sony Betamax, and then the more popular VHS. Betamax was actually felt to be the superior technology, but Sony could not establish the relative advantage of the difference that they offered. It did not become adopted as an industry standard, which would go a very long way to establishing value for it. And it was more expensive than VHS, even though it was felt to be a superior technology. So a big challenge that marketers have because of the presence of competition is establishing the value of the differences in their offerings in the marketplace. Other complications to exchange would involve the complex structure of the parties that are involved in in the exchange. Uh, if it's just a one-to-one, literally a one-to-one situation, that's not incredibly complex. But if you have a buyer and seller organization, you may have a lot of different influences or inputs on the buyer side. You may have several different inputs on the marketer side. So the needs that are perceived on both sides could be different. They could be competing. And I'm not talking about between buyer and seller, I'm talking about internally on each side. And that would create an incredible challenge for a marketer to satisfactorily resolve if they cannot understand what needs are perceived on the buyer side, even when many different parties have some input. There could be a misunderstanding of the value proposition. There are many products that have or could have great value in the marketplace, but the marketer simply does not know how to convey the value of the product that they're offering to their target market. My son worked for a startup firm several years ago. They had a wonderful product, and one of the things that they were struggling with was how to message what that product could do for their target market members. And when I learned about the product, it was incredibly obvious what it could do, uh, but I could see the challenge they had in putting it into words, something very simple, something very lasting that would get the point across of what the value proposition would be. That's different from miscommunications. Miscommunications occur when parties don't listen to each other or they speak in a language that is not necessarily understood by the other side. Now, I'm not talking about languages like English, Spanish, German, uh, Mandarin, Chinese. What I'm speaking about there is marketers may fall in love with buzzwords and industry jargon for their particular industry, and they could completely lose members of their target market if they're not speaking in their language. Back when personal computers were first becoming popular in the late 90s, it was very common to go shopping for one, speak to a salesperson who would immediately start launching off into megahertz, uh, megabytes. Gigabytes did not exist back then in personal computers, clock speeds, and things of that nature. For some people that had some exposure to computer technology and information technology terms, there was some meaning attached there. But to the typical person who was looking to buy a computer, speaking of clock speeds meant nothing to them. Speaking of megabytes meant nothing to them. RAM, the term RAM, meant nothing to them. Instead, the marketer should have been focusing on the fact that a higher clock speed means it can produce more commands faster and do things faster for you. If it has more RAM, that means it doesn't have to spend as much time seeking information from a hard drive. It can work faster for you. If you have a larger hard drive capacity, you can store more on there without having to shift to outside storage. These were in the days before the cloud existed. So those marketers should have spoken in terms that meant something to the consumer market, which is what they were trying to unlock at that time. Some marketers did a great job of doing that, some didn't, and lost out on some great opportunities. And so that happens in very, very many industries is that there's miscommunication because listening doesn't occur. Uh, Perhaps a marketer wants to emphasize benefits that mean nothing to the target market members. That's another form of miscommunications. if you've ever been exposed to a diagram of the process of communication, you can see where the gaps exist and where the areas where miscommunications may exist are very prevalent. So, what's the key to success in marketing? Well, first of all, it's to establish a competitive advantage. And for lasting success, it must be a durable and sustainable advantage. So, the term sustainable competitive advantage is a very important one. And what that means is something that a firm or an organization does very well that is very difficult to imitate by competitors. That provides a sustainable competitive advantage. And so we can look around in different industries and get an idea of what that could be. And so here's some rough areas where sustainable competitive advantage could be existent. First of all, they can be input based. And by input based, we're going to look at something that is internal to a particular firm. So it could be the resources that a firm has at their disposal. Now, it could be natural resources, it could be human resources, it could be real estate, it could be relationships with customers or suppliers. Those are all examples of resources that would be input based resources. It could be the capabilities that a particular firm has. One example I like to use frequently is in the digital products or digital electronics broad area. Apple is very successful, and their capabilities are in product design and marketing. They're not a manufacturer per se. They have a very limited number of plants. For years, they only had one manufacturing plant, and it was in Ireland. They've since undertaken to build more manufacturing capacity, but they outsource a lot of their manufacturing. But they have capabilities that are very unique in their product design, their innovative ideas, their abilities to market much more effectively than others who compete with them. Another example of an input-based sustainable competitive advantage can be cost structure. A automobile manufacturer like Toyota has a much greater advantage over one like Tesla because they can buy component parts much cheaper because of the volume that they purchase in. With a retailer, for example, Walmart and Target have enormous advantages over the mom and pop stores out there because they buy in such volume. They'll get lower prices. They're able to offer the same product at lower prices and make the same type of profit margins. Because they are so large, if you want to tie it into other resources, they can have internal departments to do certain things for them, like advertising, like training, where smaller companies may have to outsource those things, which would typically be more expensive. The culture of a firm can be an incredibly important advantage if it's done correctly. And culture is something that, from a management perspective, particularly strategy, must be very well understood. What do you want your firm to be like? And so one of the cultural influences on the firm that we'll study in here will be the market orientation of the firm. We'll get introduced to that in chapter 2. But it is a philosophy, but it is also a culture that needs to permeate the firm to be most effective. Cultures don't change quickly. Cultures have long-lasting and enduring impacts on behaviors of employees and sometimes even customers and suppliers. Strong cultures that are positive can be an incredible resource that's very, very difficult to imitate. We're looking at, as I record this, the Super Bowl is going to be played in a few days. And you think about the teams that are playing in 2019, the New England Patriots and the Los Angeles Rams, which has the stronger culture. The Patriots must have an incredibly strong culture. This is their 8th or 9th appearance in the Super Bowl in the last 15 years or so. That is an incredible accomplishment. And throughout it all, they have one star that's been with them forever, Tom Brady, but the cast has changed around him throughout the years. It's got to be more than just the players. And then you look at a team like the Cleveland Browns that uh, cannot sniff the Super Bowl. They make poor decisions, or they have historically. In the last few years, they've changed a little bit, but their culture was weak. And this goes throughout any industry. The competitors have different cultures. Some serve the companies very well. Some do not serve the companies well at all. So it can be input based. Other keys to success could be output based. Superior products, uh, products that may be protected by patents, by technology, by distribution agreements, but they're just so superior that it's very difficult to take away that particular advantage. They might have been first to market. Uh, the iPod was not really the first digital music player to market, but it was the most successful. Once it got there, it became an incredible advantage for Apple. Uh, the iPod has had over 70% market share in that category since it was introduced. The customer orientation of a firm, and that's a philosophy of business. And again, it's part of the market orientation of the firm that we'll discuss in subsequent chapter. But the customer orientation of the firm allows organizations to focus on customers and their needs, to anticipate what they need, to establish strong relationships with them, to understand their strategic goals, things like that. It's mostly practiced by the marketing department since they interface with customers more. But in a organization that truly practices a market orientation, the customer orientation is a component of the market orientation. Could be the services that are provided that lead to a competitive advantage. Nordstrom's is a retailer that is recognized for being an outstanding retailer, and one service that they offer is they'll take back products. Historically, they would take back products that had been purchased at Nordstrom at any time if the customer was not satisfied with them. LL Bean does something similar. They put a few restrictions on those recently, but it's an indication of the commitment to serving the needs of their customers, making sure that they're satisfied at all times with the products that they've purchased. Some other keys to success for competitive advantage: it's got to deliver a profit advantage. We can talk about marketing in terms of being societally desirable and all of that, but marketers, with the exception of nonprofits, compete in very competitive environments. If a profit is not made, it takes away from the availability to grow the organization, to reward employees and owners for superior performance, to invest in research and development, to expand, to protect against encroachment from other competitors. There's a New Belgium brewing company in Denver. Used to be a micro brewer. I think they're a little bit bigger than that now. And in a class I taught years ago, I played a video from them and the CEO of the company, in discussing all the things they did, their philanthropic contributions, the way they treated their employees, various things like that, was very clear to make the point. But if we don't make a profit, we cannot do any of these wonderful things. So these competitive advantages that exist must deliver a profit advantage, or an organization would certainly not want to keep them going. So competitive advantages also have to strike that correct balance between effectiveness, which is an external performance, and efficiency, which is internal. Some firms focus completely on things like customer loyalty, like driving customer loyalty. Subaru, as an automobile manufacturer, is a very good example of that. They have the most loyal customers in the automobile industry. And so what customer loyalty does is it makes customers evangelists for the brand or for the product. They establish such a strong relationship, they're not looking for viable substitutes. but Subaru is certainly not a low cost supplier. So that's not an internal efficiency thing that they have going for them. High switching costs uh, can come about because of customer loyalty, but high switching costs are more than just the financial costs involved. If you will, it's just the trouble involved in changing things. So firms could provide some sort of system uh, to their customers that they may not be entirely pleased with, but the cost of switching are so high that they just don't want to be troubled with it. That's the way a lot of software manufacturers stay in business is once they get their product in place, and get it ensconced in the practices of an organization, the organization just does not want to mess with a conversion because it's so much trouble, not just financially, but in terms of time, in terms of training, in terms of changing habits, uh, in terms of changing schedules on various things. Those are high switching costs and could be an indicator of the effectiveness of something. Efficiency, internal performance, lower cost structures. If a firm buys in such high quantities that their per unit costs for materials are lower than their competitors, if they have a superior culture, which is always going to be internal, yet it would affect some of the outside influences. Those are things that can produce those enduring and sustainable competitive advantages. So sustainable competitive advantages can provide long-term benefits uh, to marketers as they conduct their marketing practices. So we kind of had a little bit of overview of you know, what's important to marketing, some of the key concepts, exchange, value, and competitive advantage are things you always need to keep in mind as you think about developing marketing plans and being effective in dealing with the customers that you have fought so hard to gain, to keep pleased, and hopefully to keep for in the future.